Power to the people. At least that's what the Constitutional Court decided on 11 June 2020. The New Nation Movement versus President of South Africa. The court ruled that the Electoral Act was unconstitutional since it contained no mechanism for individuals to contest for national and provincial elections. In some corners, the judgment is being celebrated as a game changer, with major effects for South African politics. But that's not the position of the skeptics, who argue that the judgment might change a few things in the political system, but for the most part, it will be business as usual, even for the upcoming elections in 2024. Well, today, the Center for Human Rights is going to unpack a few of these issues. My name is Thomas White. I'm a researcher and a news anchor at Power FM, and I'm going to be moderating today's discussion, where we figure out the implications for individual candidacy on South African politics. To help us understand these issues, we've enlisted the help of 4 experts in matters of democracy and electoral policy. The first is Lani from the New Nation Movement, which is a civil society organization that first litigated the matter before the Apex Court. Next is Dr. Sithembile Mbete. She's a lecturer at the University of Pretoria. Dr. Mbete has published extensively on the economic freedom fighters, as well as the emergence of populism in South African politics. Third will be addressed by Olufunto Akinduro, who works for International IDEA, which is the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. And then we have Professor Ivor Sarakinski, an associate professor at Wits University. So on behalf of the Center for Human Rights, I'd like to thank our panelists for being here. I'd also like to extend a word of thanks to you, the viewers joining us on Zoom. We appreciate your support. We'd also like for you to be involved. So if you have any questions, drop a message in the comment section and I'll be ready to relay those to our speakers. Another way for you to get involved is through a poll, which I think should be showing up right now. We'll have 2 polls, one at the start, so that we can gauge your feelings, and then after, towards the end of our presentation. And the question there is, what drew you towards today's human rights talk on elections in South Africa? And there's a range of options that you can choose. This is just so that we get a better understanding of who our audience is. So I think we'll get straight into it. I want to open up the floor to Bulelani of the New Nation Movement. But to start you off, Bulelani, I have a question. Winning this case was already a major victory, but I get the sense that the real work is yet to come, because now the challenge is to ensure that the amended Electoral Act is going to live up to the blueprint set out in the Constitution. Are you feeling optimistic for the next stage?
Well, thank you so much, Thomas, and thank you even to the viewers. We are so optimistic about the future of this country, and we, even as an unknown entity, a New Nation Movement that took this matter to the Apex Court, we have a strong belief that the judgment that was handed down by Justice Madlanga will definitely have an impact in the political landscape in this country. We believe that things are not going to be the same in terms of the weight or rather the level of change. That is going to depend on what we are going to do from now going forward in terms of engaging with Parliament, with the IEC and all the role players, the stakeholders that are out there from the academic space, NGO space, business space, because we've always said that our case was not even so much about us having what we already have at local government level. It was always about to say something is wrong in the country. And if the electoral system is contributing, to the challenges that we face, maybe it is a good place to just hit that spot with the hope that if we win the case, and as we have done, we're hoping that many people are going to say we are now taking up the responsibility of being part of shaping, how the electoral system is going to look. We know that this is the terrain of the territory of Parliament, of the National Assembly. But we also believe that we have a constitutional democracy. It is not a parliamentary democracy. So in spite of the fact that Parliament now has to craft a legislation that is going to be compliant to the Constitution, we also believe that active citizens have a major role to play, even in terms of guiding and giving assistance and support to the National Assembly. So we are highly optimistic.
What I wanted to ask Lani, what was it in politics that had motivated this decision to approach the court? What do you think were some of the defects of the system as it currently stands that drove you to approach the court?
Well, the biggest issue, Thomas, is that the political parties continue, to be disconnected from the electorate. The political parties choose and continue to ignore the calls of the people of saying we would want to have public representatives in the National Assembly and in the provincial legislature, people of character, people of integrity, people that have a proven track record of serving their communities, people that are capable, people that have the expertise and the skill. And yet with the closed party list system, political parties could literally make promises, to us as the voters, and literally for the past 15, 20 years, we have really been used as voting cows, where political parties make all the grand promises, and yet they know that there is no mechanism for us to hold them accountable should they not deliver on any of the promises. So for us, that was the biggest issue, that this closed party list, it does not afford the citizens, the opportunity to choose a Thomas White, for example, a person that they know that they can touch and they can feel, and this person comes from our community or our constituency. We have a clear relationship with this person, and we know that this person can represent our interests with dignity, and with pride, and really advance the cause of that constituency or that community. So that was the biggest issue for us, to say, if we can have something that, even if, for example, the parliament or the political parties could say, wow, after this judgment, we need to change the way of us electing our representatives. Instead of, for example, let's take the ANC, that would have an elective conference where the 400 delegates, make a decision for 49 million people as to who must go to parliament. And even if people are continuing to burn down in the infrastructure and are even asking, for a person to step down, the political parties continue, to beg those people. We are hoping that if this judgment can even have the slightest of impacts, even in how the political parties nominate and choose their people, that would be a victory to a certain degree for the ordinary South Africans on the street.
So now it's up to Parliament to perform surgery on the Electoral Act, decide what the next act is going to look like. For the New Nation movement, what is it that you would like to be there? What would you like to see in this next act? What are some of the nitty-gritties that you would prefer to be ironed out by then?
Well, Thomas, I think one of the sentiments that people have shared with us over the last 3-4 years, because what people do not know is that we have been engaging, crisscrossing the country, going, to the communities to hear what is it that they think has to happen, what has to change. The sense that we have been getting from the people is that people want to feel part of the process. People want to be properly consulted. They do not want public hearings that are just fulfilling righteousness, instead of really hearing the heart and the minds of the people. So for us, we are not even, we've been engaging and hearing the hearts of the people, but what we're hoping for is that this judgment is going to heighten even, the process, that there is this process that is underway and people can get involved. We are planning even to go, to have road shows and just set up these public hearings in the different provinces of the country. We are also started to engage the IEC to say, IEC, how can we be of support? How can we engage you so that this process is indeed legitimate? We are also hoping, and we have engaged some of the academia, to be part of the team that supports us. We've engaged some of the former leaders, or people that have been in the IEC, even some former MPs who have said, Lani and the New Nation, we definitely want to be part of this process. So we are we are trying to engage as much as possible. But as to what the parliament does, it is totally up to them, but we're hoping to put as much pressure as possible to them. We are hoping that they will know that people have a great interest in this matter, and their views have to be taken into account.
I want to speak briefly about the question of traditional leadership. One of the motivations for one of the litigants in this case was that South Africa has traditional leaders, and these leaders have constitutional protections. They are a fundamental part of South Africa's governance structure, and yet they have felt excluded by the dynamics of the political parties. So you find that political parties might roll out a traditional leader when it's time for elections in a bid to appeal to the electorate. We've seen some similar things occur in relation to King Goodwill's Wedantini. How do you think that this new decision, this inclusion of individual candidacy, could be used to create a kind of platform for a more democratic traditional leadership in South Africa?
Look, for us, we have been engaging with the traditional leaders, quite a number of them, particularly, the ones that are coming from the First Nations and the Khoi and the San people, who have felt that they have been marginalized since 1652. So the sense is that if this judgment is handled properly, which we are going to try and make, we're not going to leave any stone unturned, in trying to, to assist in making sure that this judgment is handled with the care that it deserves. We are hoping that those traditional leaders who have people, that are backing them and that are leaving them in their communities will be able to actually be nominated, to these provincial and national structures, so that their voices could be represented in the corridors of parliament.
Okay, so let's cross now to Dr. Mbete. Dr. Mbete, you've written extensively about populism in South Africa. How do you think that this is going to, what are the implications you think as far as populism is going to be concerned? Do we have the doctor?
She was connected, but I think she might be having audio issues.
Okay. In the meantime, then I think we'll just cross over to Funto. Funto, so you're from International Idea. If someone spends their time the way that you do, looking at elections across Africa, they might be thinking that this, for South Africa, is now a time for cross-fertilization. So we are looking at election systems. This is a time for us to consider the different election systems across Africa and maybe infuse some of those into our jurisdiction. What do you think are the lessons that South Africa could learn from other African countries? And then if you have any other general remarks that you'd like to make, those are also welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I think this discussion comes at an interesting time in South Africa's history. I mean, electoral systems generally are part of constitution building and national development. In South Africa's case, the negotiations around the constitution, these were parts of the discussion during the transition in 1994. Of course, this is not the first time that the question of the electoral system is being discussed, considering that there was a report as far back as 2003. So the interesting question is, why now? And I think, first of all, is just to say that South Africa's democracy has, it has evolved, and the recent Constitutional Court's judgment is one big step in the process of South Africa's democratic development. Hello, am I still on?
Yeah, you're still on. I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. And so it's really commendable that this judgment has come at this time. Of course, the Constitution already has very clear principles enshrined, talking about fairness, inclusiveness, simplicity, accountability. So whatever new features are introduced into the electoral system have to comply with these particular principles that are enshrined in the Constitution. So for me, South Africa certainly sets the pace for most African countries, because apart from Lesotho, I don't think there's any other African country that has taken steps to change its electoral system. And of course, this is not a complete overhaul of South Africa's electoral system. It is just a process to bring the system in line with the provisions of the Constitution. But it's a big step, and I think it's a big lesson for other countries, because you can see that the process has been there's a space for citizens to approach the court, and the Constitutional Court in South Africa has always proven itself as that space where everyone has a voice and everyone is heard fairly, and shows that the Constitution, is really there to guarantee everyone's rights. So for me, I think that's the big lesson that most African countries can draw from this. It's not based on just discussions on the floor of parliament or whatever. It is that a private citizen was able to get up and, mobilize forces to say, we think a certain proportion of the population is excluded because of the electoral system. And the courts did hear that and issued a judgment in that line. In most countries, you probably won't have such a far-reaching judgment coming up. So for me, the big thing is the fact that it's citizen-driven. It is not, it didn't come as a result of a long political process. And that for me is the big deal for this judgment in my own thinking.
So after this judgment, we've just had recent elections in Malawi, which saw Peter Mutharika, the incumbent, lose the elections. And that was also the result of a very significant decision by Malawi's Constitutional Court. Well, what do you think of the implications of the judiciary, at least ostensibly, becoming more involved in African elections, and the fact that we have seen a positive response to that in Malawi and perhaps now also in South Africa?
Indeed, I mean, the role of the judiciary in elections is an interesting one. And for us in IDEA, it's actually an area we're now looking into. Because in the African space, I think it's a two-edged sword. For some countries, you can say, bravo, this is working. And for some, I think some years ago, there was an academic article where somebody mentioned that now we are having, and was talking specifically about Nigeria, where the person said we are having what you call democracy by court order. So rather than have a space where citizens can go to the polls and cast their ballot and let that be the determining factor in an election, we are gradually moving to a space in Africa where if the court does not pronounce on an election, we do not consider it as a legitimate outcome or an acceptable outcome. And in the original design of a democratic election, is that really the intention? Or the intention really is that you have a space where citizens can consider the candidates, go to the polls, cast their ballot, and be sure that their ballots will translate to what they originally intended. So yes, the space of the court has a huge positive impact, because then you have a space where people can approach the court and get justice for if they feel they have not been treated right. But at the same time, there's also that very subtle risk where the responsibility of determining the will of the people is gradually now shifting to the judiciary. And that needs to be, you know, clearly balanced. And I like using South Africa as the example where the courts are there, but you still have a huge place for elections. And the IEC is a well-respected institution, unlike where you compare it to some other countries where the Electoral Commission is completely in disrepute. And then you only would have trust in the judiciary, which should not be the case. You should have a balance between those two spaces, and the court should only be your next step when you feel that the commission has not done its job. So those are just my immediate thoughts on the question of the role of the judiciary. And of course, you could think through Malawi versus Kenya and see how the two political spaces, you know, played out differently, and come to South Africa and think of the last local elections, where, you know, the court, you know, made that judgment about the IEC having to have physical addresses of everyone in the register. So the courts in South Africa have made very, very progressive judgments that have moved the electoral process towards, you know, a more robust, competitive and inclusive space. And for that, the space in South Africa, I will continue to commend.
Right, so let's cross over now to Dr. Mbete. Doctor, are you with us? We were having some audio problems.
Yes, I am. I've got that all sorted now.
Oh, okay, fantastic, fantastic. So we've heard from the New Nation movement. They're very optimistic. We just had a discussion now with Fundo regarding the impact of the judiciary on the conduct of elections. Do you want to step in here?
Yes, of course. So I'd like to congratulate the New Nation movement for their success in this court case with the Constitutional Court. And I take the comments around the involvement of the judiciary within the South African electoral system, and certainly what we have set out in our constitution is a separation of powers between the different arms of government, and the Constitutional Court in the New Nation judgment recognizes the importance of that separation between the work of the judiciary in relation to elections and the work of politicians and of parliament. So that is why, although the Constitutional Court ruled in New Nation that the Electoral Act is unconstitutional insofar as it prevents individuals from contesting for election, it has left the decision completely to Parliament, as is stipulated in Section 46 of the Constitution and Section 105 of the Constitution. Both of those sections state that it is Parliament, the National Assembly, that is required to put in place a law, legislation to regulate elections. And the Constitutional Court has respected that division and has basically not dictated to Parliament what kind of electoral system it should use in order to allow for individuals to contest election, and so that division is still put in place and still left in place. And so the big question now is about which of the varying electoral systems the Parliament will consider in redrafting the Electoral Act in the next 2 years, and that is going to rely a lot on public participation, on submissions, both from organizations like New Nation Movement, but also broader civil society, in order to design a new electoral system for the national and provincial elections.
So one of the proposals in relation to this new system has been the introduction of a broader constituency system, not unlike what we've seen in the local elections. How do you think that would play out in practice in South Africa?
So part of the challenge around designing a constituency system is going to be around how you divide those constituencies. So do we use the same constituency lines and ward lines? Do we use the same lines that are used in the Municipal Demarcations Act? And in that case, I mean, we won't be able to use the exact same ward boundaries because then that would mean that we would have a massive parliament of thousands of MPs. So if we're going to stay with a parliament of 400 members of parliament, then we need to think very carefully about how we design and demarcate those constituencies in a way that doesn't contradict the demarcation of constituencies in the used for municipal elections, and that also doesn't that also fits within the boundaries of the provinces as they are currently demarcated, because that's fixed. We need a constitutional amendment in order to change the demarcation of the provinces. And so it's going to be pretty complicated actually to work out how to demarcate within the current lines that allows for individual participation and individual contestation in elections. With the Van Zyl-Slabbert report and the electoral task team, whose report was handed over to government in 2003, the electoral task team did not envision a situation of individual candidates running in national and provincial elections. Rather, they imagined a situation of political parties putting forward, let's say, 3 candidates in multi-member constituencies, but people, the voter would still be voting for a political party. You wouldn't be voting for a specific individual. Now, Parliament is going to have to allow for voters to vote for specific individuals. So it's going to require a lot of thought about the demarcation of those constituencies, because the other thing is that we can't have the constituencies be too small, because then we'll have more than 400 MPs in Parliament. But if we do make those constituencies larger, then we need to think about, are we then diluting some of the what we want to achieve with having constituencies, which is about having direct accountability between the member of parliament and the electorate, and that can get diluted if the constituencies themselves are too big.
So you've made reference to the Van Zyl-Slabbert report, and at least some version of what the Constitutional Court has made reference to has always been a part of the public discourse. Why is it that it was only upon litigation by civil society we see Parliament taking this matter seriously? Why was there this lack of political will to treat individual candidacy as though it was a serious consideration in South African politics from MPs themselves?
Well, what happened with the Van Zyl-Slabbert report is that there was a majority view that the system should be adjusted to have a mixed system of proportional representation and constituency with multi-member constituencies, and then the minority view was that the system should remain unchanged, that we should remain with a closed list proportional representation system. And the government chose to go with the minority view. So they didn't put the report to a broader discussion by Parliament. And certainly the closed list proportional representation system has suited most of the political parties that are currently represented in Parliament. It gives a lot of control to political parties over their MPs. And so it's not really in the interest of different political parties to have thought of a revision of the system to allow for individual candidacy. There have been some attempts at introducing a discussion on the electoral system by individual members of Parliament using the private members bill mechanism in Parliament, but that hasn't been very successful. And so it really did take citizens taking this issue to court in order for Parliament to then start dealing with it seriously.
So then, Doctor, if you were to run for office, you run for either the provincial or the national legislature, what you would need is you would still require some kind of machinery to propel your name. So I'm thinking in the context of Patricia de Lille here. in relation to the Independent Democrats, a party which didn't have any particular discernible ideological position. It was largely perceived as a vehicle through which de Lille could run for office. Now, how would that be any different under the current system? You would still need volunteers, you would still need to approach other people, you would still need, I mean, this is a great time to talk about the implications of money in politics. So how, on the ground, in reality, how is this going to change campaigning in elections in South Africa?
That is an excellent question, and I think that one that needs to be seriously considered at the moment. And the party that you are referring to is Patricia de Lille's latest party, which is good, which was the one that she formed after she was removed as mayor of Cape Town, and which seemed to be a party just generally about good governance. And it's exactly the point that you're making, that even though it did see, it was effectively a vehicle for her to come back to national politics and re-enter parliament, it still needed a major machinery of volunteers, of funding. And one imagines that it'll be the same thing for individuals that are contesting and constituency level for the national and the provincial elections. And certainly we've seen it at local government elections, that for individuals who are contesting for ward councillor, the very few individuals often succeed to win wards at local government level. It's still parties that dominate at ward election level. And the ones that do succeed are often those who have either who've split from political parties and so have some machinery of people that are experienced and want to work with them, or who have a great deal of resources in the form of money, or people who are part of community organizations, and so have some organizational structure to help them with their campaigning. And I don't think that it's going to be very different for individuals at provincial and at national level. Of course, one of the things, and the reason why the Constitutional Court gave Parliament 24 months to come up with the new legislation, with the new Electoral Act, and Parliament had requested 36 months, but the reason why the Constitutional Court gave Parliament 24 months is because then that leaves another 24 months for the IEC to prepare its systems to be able to accommodate individuals contesting at provincial and national level. So that will also then mean issues around the registration fee. Will an individual pay a different registration fee to the political parties? Because we know that the cost of the registration fee has been a barrier to entry for many political parties. All of those issues also around the necessary amendment, because we're also going to need to amend the Political Party Funding Act, which at the moment only allows for the funding of political parties, but now will need to accommodate regulation of funding of individuals.
Right, so on this note of political party funding, the president signed into law, I think not long before the judgment, an act which requires or rather expands the provisions regarding public access to information about political party funding. We know that the president has had to make a U-turn in Parliament last year around money that was received by his son relating to Bosasa. So, and this is also a point that Olufunto can step in, but can we speak about how finance is going to affect individual candidates? Because in South Africa, there are a lot of people with a lot of money who might have been left outside of the political party. I mean, if you didn't come up through the struggle in some parties, it's very difficult for you to penetrate those spaces. So are we going to be seeing that this is how money is going to play a greater role in South African politics? I'm throwing this open to either you, Doctor, or Olufonto.
I think that was certainly, and I think that we're certainly going to see money playing a greater role in politics, exactly in the ways that you speak about people who have felt left out of the political party system but have got resources. And certainly I think there is that expectation also from the electorate. On the day of the judgment, Twitter had Patrice Motsepe was trending, I think AKA was trending, Caspar Nyovest was trending, of all kinds of people, famous people that people would vote for in the elections. And so I certainly think that it's going to add that dimension even more. Of course, what you're speaking about around Cyril Ramaphosa is the role of money in internal party contestation as well. And one of the things that I think for me is going to be, one hopes is going to come from this conversation in Parliament about amending the Electoral Act is also going to be about the regulation of how political parties themselves operate. Because without that change, unfortunately, I don't think we'll get any follow-up changes, the kinds of changes that we want with having individuals involved in elections.
So let's speak about political parties, specifically the African National Congress. So in recent, just before the 2019 elections, we had the resurfacing of this claim that there is in the ANC 2 centers of power. So you have Parliament, and then you have Luthuli House. And Luthuli House is perceived as having more control of the office of the president than Parliament. And now Luthuli House is not any constitutional body. It is rather a body belonging exclusively to the African National Congress. How do you think that this is going to affect the hegemony that political party elites have over the electoral process in general? Yeah, so I'm interested in that. How is that going to play out as a result of this?
I think that what we must be prepared for is that as these deliberations happen in Parliament, in the National Assembly, with the step now is that the National Assembly is going to need to appoint some kind of ad hoc committee to amend the Electoral Act. They can choose to have some kind of a task team or some body that looks at the issue first before it gets discussed by a committee, and then they're going to need to open public hearings and public submissions. And I think that the concern is that the political parties that are currently in Parliament are going to try and manipulate whatever the system is to ensure that they maintain the power of party elites as far as is possible. Even in a situation where individuals can contest. And I think that leads to something that we need to be aware of when Bulelani was speaking about, that it's unjust that we have 5,000 delegates in a conference hall that decide party representatives through party lists. Let's remember that that system is a function of how the ANC as a party functions. It's not something that's set out in the constitution or that's legislated, right? That is the ANC's internal party system that has this impact on the country's democracy, because so many people then end up voting for the ANC. And so if you don't, whether or not individuals can contest, if as many people vote for the ANC, the country is still going to be subject to internal ANC processes, because their internal processes will still affect us if they are still the majority party that is elected by the electorate. And so I think that we always need to keep in mind that the reason why political party processes, and particularly the ANC's internal processes, have such a big effect on our politics is because so many people end up voting for the ANC in every election. Now, I think there is a question about whether the ANC, we know that the ANC support has been declining over the years. And so whether or not the people but many of the people that have stopped voting for the ANC have not voted for any other party because they don't feel represented by those parties. So the big question is whether the people who've stopped voting for the ANC are now going to move their vote and vote for individual candidates, and therefore bolster the number of individual candidates that will then have a place as MPs in our parliament.
So I want to switch over now to Professor Sarakinsky. Professor, you wrote News 24 not too long ago, quote, "The real significance of the Constitutional Court judgment is that it will weaken but not dissolve the power of party bosses." Can you expand a bit more of your views here?
Thanks, Thomas. I'm going to speak on mic. I've got bad internet, so I'll keep my video off.
Not a problem.
So it's the basic problem of the list system, in that you've got a dynamic inside all the parties as to where candidates end up on the list. And that means that the party bosses have exceptional power to determine where candidates stand. And obviously that's important, because if a party is going to get fewer votes, where you are on that list determines whether you go into public office or not. And that means you've got competition between candidates to get as high up on the list as possible. That's the incentive structure of the PR system. And that produces a whole range of behaviors that aren't necessarily democracy or accountability enhancing. It incentivizes obsequiousness and passivity in terms of what the party bosses want. And this has major implications in terms of political oversight of the executive, in terms of holding people to account who control the list that puts you in office in the first place. And this is the big problem. And it's not unique to South Africa. It's the same in Italy. It's the same in Israel. It's the same in a range of countries that have PR systems.
Professor?
Yes, that's my answer.
Oh, sorry. No, sorry, I thought your mic had cut off. So then what I wanted to ask you, what are the potential drawbacks of implementing this kind of more mixed system for South Africa?
Well, it depends how the mixed system is brought in place. And my view is that the Constitutional Court ruling is a bit more activist than it ought to have been. And one of the reasons why I say that is that it would have been quite simple to say something along the lines of, individuals are free to set up an Iver Sarakinsky political party, and they can stand for election as the Iver Sarakinsky political party. And in that way, you allow individuals to stand. And we've seen this at provincial level, and we've seen this at national level, and we've seen independents at local level. Independents can stand at municipal level. And it's far from clear whether independents or the small parties that represent individuals actually contribute to democracy. And that's why I think that the Constitutional Court ruling is a bit adventurous in terms of prescribing to Parliament how to design an electoral system. Nonetheless, that's the ruling, and we've got to abide by it. And on that basis, there are advantages to a mixed system. Absolutely there are. New Zealand's works really well, but there's no guarantee that just because you've got constituency elections which flow from this, or whether you've got independence, you're going to have better accountability. And this is the flaw in the argument. The rules determine how accountability is exercised. That's the first point. The second point is that individuals or small parties end up aligning themselves with other parties, especially on tight issues. And you start to have horse trading around coalitions. And we've seen this at local level. And that absolutely undermines accountability. It undermines representation, and it's actually counterproductive. So I'm far less optimistic that many might be with this ruling in terms of opening up an opportunity for better accountability. I think that a constituency component within a PR system like New Zealand creates a potential for better accountability, but there's no guarantee that that accountability potential will ever be realized because of the politics around this.
So in that case, what is it that you would prefer for South Africa? If you were the judge at the Constitutional Court and you were to be the activist, what would your proposal look like?
I would have argued along the lines of Parliament ought to decide this and ought to begin a public process on whether we need to change, and if we do, how we change. And in that way, keep the Constitutional Court out of determining the nature of the electoral system, because it's a deceptive judgment. It says individuals must stand, but in enabling individuals to stand, you end up changing fundamentally the electoral system. So it's the butterfly's wings that have massive implications. And they knew this, hence the 24 months. And that's why it's a controversial judgment in terms of its implications.
Professor Pierre de Vos was arguing not too long ago that if parties in Parliament presently had wanted to avoid this kind of thing, the risk that you're busy speaking about, what they would do is they would essentially, with 2/3 majority, effect an amendment of the Constitution. So the reasoning of the court is that this judgment, or rather is that the Electoral Act is unconstitutional to the effect that it does not align with the current Constitution, which should be interpreted to extend the right to individuals to participate as individuals in elections. Now, what De Vos is busy arguing is that if the state wants to avoid this, all they need to do is effect a constitutional amendment to specify that it is only through parties that individuals can exercise their right to vote.
That's one option that could be taken, and in that way circumvent the whole implication of this. And in terms of Parliament reserving its right to determine democratic practice without judicial interference and without executive interference, that would be a good way forward, because you'd have to build up a multi-party consensus in terms of achieving that 2/3 majority. Without that, and it's unlikely to go that route, there will be the amendment to the Electoral Act and related legislation to enable some form of multi-party, a mixed proportional system, as it's called. And that's suboptimal because Parliament's doing it under duress. And in a democracy, you want Parliament to be the driver of these decisions.
I see Dr. Mbete has raised her hand. Do you want to jump in here, Doctor?
Yes, I just wanted to jump in. Thank you so much, Prof. Sarakinski. It's nice to see you and to be on the panel with you again. I just wanted to jump in to highlight something that did come out of the Constitutional Court judgment, and part of the reason for the interpretation that the Constitutional Court took of that Section 19 of the Constitution, which is that let's remember that when the Constitution was drafted. So firstly, during the Cadessa negotiations, 1990 to 93, and then when the process of drafting the Constitution itself, that culminated in 1996, the closed list proportional representation system was never seen as a permanent arrangement. It was always meant to be amended at some point, which was the rationale. It was meant to actually be, so in 1996, the constitutional, the electoral system, which is why the electoral system is set out in the transitional measures section of the Constitution in that annexure. It was meant to, the PR system was meant to work for the 1994 and the 1999 elections, and then a new system was meant to be developed that would allow for some perhaps allow for some constituency representation for the 2004 election, and that's why the electoral task team was set up in the first place. And it was a political choice to not engage in that discussion for the 2004 elections and to shelve that that discussion. But basically what the Constitutional Court has now said is that now that there has been a citizens' mobilization to question the PR system as it currently is, there is nothing in the Constitution that the Constitution allows for that questioning and for that to be discussed in Parliament. And so it would have been immensely difficult, I think, for the Constitutional Court to really justify a decision to keep the system as it is, because the system as it is was never fixed constitutionally. It was always up for amendment. And this is where I disagree slightly with Prof. Sarakinsky, in that I do think that the Constitution has left it to Parliament to then decide on the modalities of the new system.
Lani, you wanted to come in here.
No, we need to come back in.
Yes, thank you, Thomas.
This is
okay, hang on, just so that no one's talking over each other. But I think, Professor, you come in and then we'll have Lani.
Because I'm being debated and I need to respond.
Please, go ahead.
Let me be quick. The whole Slubbert, Van Zyl Slubbert Commission was exactly a response to that ambiguity that Sithembile mentioned. And Parliament put it on ice. And just because they put it on ice doesn't mean that the Constitutional Court has the right to interfere in the sphere of legislative matters. And that's why I think that the Constitutional Court would have been advised better to have said something like encouraging Parliament to resuscitate those proposals in order to deal with the issue that was still outstanding. Because now what we've got is the courts intervening in politics, undermining the credibility of political processes, undermining the processes of Parliament, undermining the whole question of voting. Why vote if you've got a bunch of people sitting somewhere else deciding how government is going to not just work, but be formed in the very first instance? And I think that that's the greatest challenge to our constitutional democracy at the moment. The powers of decision-making being taken out of the hands of elected representatives. And that's the reason why I'm concerned with the judgment, not about the histories and the ambiguities. I know all of that. I'm concerned with the implications of what this means. Thank you.
So, Bulelani, we've appeared to engage in a discussion now about the separation of powers. And we're hearing that what your court case has opened up is the entire Pandora's box of the judiciary getting involved in decision-making. It's almost interfering with the role of the legislature. Is there something you want to say in relation to this? Since it all starts with you.
Thank you once more, Thomas. I think I would love to disagree quite a bit with the Prof. First and foremost, South Africa is a constitutional democracy. And what that means is that supersedes everything else in the country. The Nationalist Party government was a parliamentary democracy. So Parliament was the ultimate. In this case, we have a constitutional democracy. So whenever there is a disjuncture between what Parliament deems appropriate and what the Constitution is providing to the citizens, that's where the Constitutional Court has to clarify. And that is exactly what we're hoping the Constitutional Court would do, because we're saying for us as lay people, when you read Section 18, for example, which speaks clearly about the freedom of association, which has both the positive and the negative side of it. The positive side is that you, Thomas, Bulelani, Prof, and Dr. Ste can agree to form a group. That is, that's our freedom of association. We have that choice to associate. But the negative side is that if Bulelani does not have any confidence anymore in the Prof, in Ste, in Thomas, and wants to go it alone, that is also a basic and a constitutional human right that we have been given. So, that's just Section 18. And then Section 19 is very, very clear that the primacy there is on the citizen. So we're saying to the Constitutional Court, to us, this looks very clear. Every adult citizen has a right to stand for public office and if elected, hold that office. Are we correct and saying that we understand this, that it does this right, we do not need political parties, or we do not need to form political parties or be members of political parties to enjoy the right. So what the Constitutional Court has said and done is to say, New Nation Movement, you guys have been correct in your interpretation. And now what the Constitutional Court has done is very clearly to say, if you look at page 8 of the judgment, for example, they're quite clear to say there is no judicial overreach here. For us, it was to clarify what the Constitution says and to read what the Electoral Act says, is there a disjuncture or not? And according to them, there is a disjuncture, but they have given it, as Dr. Stey had said earlier, they've given the whole thing back, to Parliament to say, Parliament, fix it so that it complies with the Constitution. But now, if you listened to the parliamentary report back by the Home Affairs and the IEC on this judgment, it was very interesting to note that one of the speakers, the MP of the ANC, I think is the Honorable Ganti, he was very clear to say this judgment and what the ANC has always fought for, that the people shall govern, there is no contradiction, because what it does, it places power to where it's supposed to, the ordinary citizen. Because what we have experienced over a period of time is that we were hoping that the political parties are going to represent the interests of the ordinary people there. But when they get them, they begin to pass laws that they never even dealt with, even in their policy conferences. So I disagree greatly with the prof that says the Constitutional Court here is meddling and even undermining the processes, of Parliament. For us, this judgment, I think it confirms our long-held view that the system that we have used over the last 25 years was supposed and was designed to use just for one term from 1994 to 1999. And between that first term, that is why the matter was actually put under the transitional arrangements, as Dr. Sithembile had earlier indicated, that the parliament, the first parliament under the leadership of the late President Rolihlahla Mandela, was supposed to actually come up with an electoral law or electoral act that was going to be more permanent. But they were not able to do that. And our research tells us that then towards the end of the first term, political parties agreed and had a concession was made that as much as they were supposed by law to have this electoral system applied only for the first term, they agreed to extend it. But they gave an undertaking that in the second term, they will definitely put together an electoral system that is going to be compliant to the Constitution. So for us, what has happened here is that justice has eventually been given to the ordinary citizens. And it is very sad that the people who are suffering the most are the ones who are excited about this judgment, because for the longest of times, their voices have not been heard. But unfortunately, the elite and unfortunately, quite a number of the academia, the professors and many, people who are actually sitting comfortably in their homes, to be quite honest, are saying, no, this thing is not going to work. And maybe one last point that I must make, Thomas. For me and for us as the New Nation, we find it very disturbing that South Africans are not seeing this as an opportunity, for us to be creative, instead of continuing to import what has happened in the other countries. Professor Ivo was making a reference of what is happening in New Zealand. And we're saying New Zealand is not South Africa. South Africa is in Africa. We have our unique challenges and we have our unique gifts. Why can't we say, what are the challenges that we are having and facing, currently? What is the kind of system that is going to deal with the challenges that we have? He was talking even about that. The nature of the rules determine.
Some of the people who have not been heard yet are the participants who are watching this on Facebook and Zoom as well. And I'd also like to include them. So I just want to lastly, Ulufuntu had raised her hand, And then after that, if we can transition to the Q&A, please.
Okay.
I just thought very quickly to just step in here and talk about two things. And I think the first time I spoke, you had asked the question about the role of the judiciary and questions of judicial overreach.
Yes.
And the professor had, in his response, sort of touched on that to say that his opinion of the judgment is that it is slightly an overreach. And I, in my opinion, would like to also disagree with that, because in this case, it's really just a question of the Constitutional Court making a ruling to bring the Electoral Act in line with the principles enshrined in the Constitution. And that was why when I spoke initially, I said it's different from the case in Lesotho, where it was a complete adoption of a completely new electoral system. Here, it is more of the question of why would you allow independence at municipal level, but then you come to national and provincial level, and then independence are not allowed. And where does that leave us with the issue of when you say it's a democracy and then you have a law that deliberately excludes a portion of the population? The other point as well I wanted to talk about is the issue of context. 2003, yes, when the first report, the first significant report on South Africa's electoral system was delivered, that particular report was subject to a very, very political discussion. This time around, I think it's different because it's not being led by the political class. It's a citizen-led process, that is one. And also to say South Africa's politics has come to a point where, you now have the whole free bond generation and generation, and then people now looking at parties differently. The whole liberation struggle credential is gradually rolling back, not just in South Africa, if you even look at Southern Africa generally, because now you have much younger voters who don't have a strong connection to the liberation struggle era. And everybody's question is just, who are you and what can you deliver to me? So I think the context has changed considerably in South Africa, and that's why we are now having this space. The judiciary in South Africa, in my opinion, has not in any way, because there's still that space for Parliament to return and debate the issues, and for the IEC to think through the process of implementing whatever the amendments of the Electoral Act will be. So in my opinion, the judgment was not an overreach, and I don't think it compromised the principles of separation of powers.
So, Professor, you aren't the only person who's concerned about the implications of the judicialization of politics in South Africa. In the minority, and thank you, Professor Wessels, for pointing this out, Justice Prominent seems to agree with you.
Yes, indeed.
Professor?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to reply. And I replied respectfully to my colleagues, and I don't want to cast aspersions on them. So I'm choosing my language very politely, and I think we need to follow that practice. It's a really important matter, and I'm not questioning the constitutional right of individuals to stand in Parliament. Please don't misunderstand me and don't insult me. What I'm saying is that another way could have been found to enable that. A way of pressuring Parliament to respond to that without having to be told to do that by the Constitutional Court. And I think that that's really what it comes down to. So please don't misrepresent my position, firstly. And secondly, don't start to say it's because of privileged people here, there, and everywhere who see it differently. It's a really important matter. It's a constitutional matter. It's a question of a constitutional democracy consolidating itself into the next generation in terms of it ensuring that Parliament responds to the needs of citizens without outside agents telling Parliament what to do. It's a massively important issue for future generations. And that's why I've raised the issue. And I am aware of Justice Vroneman's minority view. And as we know, history is written by the victor. And I'm just very concerned that the victorious view is going to dominate and extinguish minority views on this matter, which are completely unacceptable in a constitutional democracy.
Thank you, Professor. I think, yes, I think going forward, we should keep it civil. Let's not try and personalize our views. Dr. Mbete.
Thomas?
Yes, please.
Please allow me, because I think the professor was referring to me.
Okay, no, I think, you know what, I think going forward, so obviously this judicialization of politics has gotten everyone's blood boiling. I think let's return to this issue of campaign financing, which has not been addressed. And I know that Funto, you had wanted to make a point in relation to it.
May I just respond quickly? Thomas, please allow me.
I think let's move. Let's move ahead. Let's go ahead. Funto.
Okay, I just wanted to make just speak in addition, because I think Sithembile had raised some of the issues around campaigning and campaign finance, because I mean currently with the party-based system, and if you look at the the PPFA, Political Party Finance Act, clearly, you know, the principles are there to guide how parties receive funds, and for the IEC to regulate that. I just wanted to mention that now when you introduce independent candidacy, this adds another layer of responsibility to the IEC's role. And when the PPFA was signed into law, that was one of the concerns that we raised, that this additional responsibility for the IEC is the IEC, you know, now well placed to do that. So now if you add this new layer, when you look at independent candidacy, there's another aspect to it though, because the internal party nomination, the party list system is completely different. Once you introduce independent candidacy, then you need to begin to think through the different nomination processes that these people, the vetting process, approval processes that the independent candidates need to go through. And I just thought it'd be interesting to also think through those new responsibilities that will be placed at the desk of the IEC as this, you know, new feature of the political process then comes forward. The other question, and I think Sithembile mentioned that, is how do I run as an independent candidate? Is it a cheap process? Once the constituencies are drawn and independent candidates need to run, how do they raise money? Looking at the PPFA currently, I mean, it does talk about how much you can receive. It does not put any ceilings on how much you can spend. So it leaves the door open for the undue influence of money in politics in South Africa. So if independent candidates are going to be introduced, then it is very important that the PPFA be reconsidered to ensure that there are also ceilings on expenditure. Because if it remains open, and I as an independent candidate have to raise enough financial muscle to stand against big parties that have been there since 1994, then what does that then say about how much finance I have to raise? And at the end of the day, once you start raising a lot of money, it then comes back to the question we ask in most African countries. You need to pay back the tax to the people who gave you the money when you were running once you get into office. So we don't want things to go that way. And it will then be important to revisit the PPFA to ensure that you don't only have prohibitions on where you can get money from, ceilings on how much money you can raise, but also there has to be ceilings on how much money can you spend, because that's where you then have the level playing field to ensure that it's not just a question of how much can I raise and how much can I throw into the process.
Dr. Mbete, how would you feel about a cap on spending in relation to campaigning? How exactly do you think something like that could work? And is it entirely feasible?
Certainly, I think that we should have a cap on spending for campaigning, and I do think that it is feasible. One of the things that has escalated the cost of elections over time has been that the election costs have increased, have escalated by how much money the big political parties have access to. And the ANC has been able to use patronage, has been able to use its incumbency in government at national level and in 8 of the provinces in order to fund its election campaigning using public funds, even though that is technically illegal. And certainly both what we've seen with both the ANC and with the Democratic Alliance has done similar things in a more slick way, in a more sophisticated way in the Western Cape. But what we've also seen from both of those parties is that they've been able to raise a great deal more from the private sector, from big corporations, than other parties because of their major status. And so the fact that they can raise more money means that they can spend more money. And so we've seen the costs of elections skyrocket, but we certainly could place a cap on election spending in order to force political parties to do things more economically. We could also, I think, would need to also bring in more measures around, for example, the amount of media access that political parties and individuals have, in order to even the playing field a great deal more than it currently is. I just wanted to raise an issue that Olufunto has raised, just to support an issue that she's raised, which is around the resources of the IEC. What we know is that over the past 10 years has been a big characteristic, has been a consistent defunding of the IEC, including in 2018, before the 2019 elections. The IEC had 300 million rand less to run the 2019 elections than it did to run the 2014 elections. And so with all of the burdens that have now been placed on the IEC, with the responsibilities in terms of the Political Party Funding Act, and the burdens that are going to be added to the IEC in terms of managing the new electoral system, whatever it is, we're going to need to have serious lobbying and more attention paid to then adequately resourcing the IEC to actually exercise its responsibilities properly. Because if we don't do that, then no good is going to come out of any amendment to any law.
Thomas, just to add on to, sorry, yes, Thomas, just to add on to what she said, your question on whether it's feasible or it's possible in South Africa. There are other countries where you do have ceilings on party finance. I mean, for instance, in Nigeria. But the question of whether it's feasible, I like that. And in South Africa, I think it's more feasible because the South African economy is less cash based, and South Africa has already a strong financial system that it's easy to trace every taxpayer and trace every bank account and questions around that. So for me, South Africa actually presents a stronger case of regulation and monitoring of party financing compared to other countries that have such ceilings listed in their laws. But when you speak to the electoral commissions, they're going to tell you, we don't control the financial system here. And if the financial system is very cash-based, you can't get me to chase every politician that puts a bag of cash under their beds. But in South Africa, it's it's slightly different, and the financial system, is more developed and makes it even much more possible to trace and monitor. Thanks.
So I'd like to begin by thanking, or rather end by thanking all of our panelists for their contributions. Could we please, for about two minutes, get a brief wrap up of your views, any parting shot you want to leave us, just a quick, impassioned closing remarks. We'll start with you, Bulelani.
Thomas, thank you so much. I just want to register my concern You know, I think many people forget that some of these conversations are purely academic. And what tends to happen is that we tend to be overlooked, you know, because we are seen as these nobodies, and we're comfortable with that. But the truth of the matter, Thomas, and everyone that is listening, is that South Africans are beginning to open their eyes that actually they have the power to control the country as citizens without having to go to political parties. And you'll be amazed at the measures that ordinary South Africans have started to put together to ensure that when the time comes for them to be nominated in those communities that are ready to be nominated and are well equipped to go and represent those views and those voices of those communities. So I'm hoping that as these webinars continue, you know, ordinary South Africans will actually be given more space and more time to share what they understand and what they think the country should go, how the country should go. And one more, we need to be more creative in terms of, instead of just wanting to import, you know, there's electoral systems, we have an opportunity of designing and crafting something fresh that is going to represent Africa and be a beacon for the whole continent. Thank you.
Dr. Mbete, your parting shot.
Thank you very much for that. I think that, you know, and what this discussion has shown is that we are going to have a long period of debate and very robust argument ahead of us in order to decide how we're going to actualize the Constitutional Court's judgment. I just want to give a correction to Prof. Leroux around Justice Froneman's minority judgment wouldn't actually allow for the kind of process that Prof. Sarakinski has spoken about, which is that, you know, the Constitutional Court should have sent it back to Parliament to say that Parliament needs to open up a discussion on this issue. Rather, what Justice Froneman said was that that Section 19 of the Constitution does not allow for individual participation in an election, and that democratic participation is allowed for in other ways. For individuals is allowed for in other ways in the Constitution. But certainly for me, I think that what this debate is and what this webinar has just shown is the deep complexity around these issues. And what I certainly hope for is that we will have a robust period of public participation across all levels in order to get the views of South African South African society broadly around what a new electoral act should look like.
Funto.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks to the organizers for giving me an opportunity to sit on this panel. Just in terms of parting words, I think mine would be more of a word of caution to say that an amendment or an adoption of a new electoral system is just one step in a longer term democratic development process. And also to say that it's important to manage expectations. I remember Professor Ivor, when he first spoke, talked about the fact that everybody expects a huge level of accountability from now going forward, which might not necessarily be the case. But the point is, it's important that South Africa's core political questions continue to be answered and addressed. Amending the electoral system might be one step, but it is not by any chance the solution, because South Africa's political and historical questions are deep-seated. And for me, I think the main thing is to continue to have a platform for national dialogue and to continue to give that space for individuals and every sector of the population to express their concerns, and for these concerns to be heard fairly and to be addressed. Once those spaces are provided, my sense is that whether or not the electoral system is changed or you even have other questions being addressed in future, as long as those spaces for fairness and inclusivity are there, the country would remain on its road to continued democratic development. Thank you.
And then the final word from you, Professor.
Oh, thanks, Thomas, and I'll be quick. And I want to make a simple point in conclusion. There's no perfect electoral system. every single electoral system or every combination of techniques for running elections has pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses. If we think that this constitutional amendment is going to lead to a significantly better electoral system, then I think comparative experience around the world, including African countries, would encourage us to show some caution here. This is very difficult stuff in terms of designing an electoral system. The way you do it is significant. And the best way to do it actually is to have popular buy-in in terms of parliamentary processes. Without that, people start to become cynical and politics becomes a business, instead of politics being about representing the public good and the will of the people. Thank you.
Thank you all for the discussion. I found it very illuminating. I really enjoyed it. I think it's one of the best, dare I say it, webinars that the Center has held so far over the course of this series. So really thank you for all of your views. I've really learned a lot, and I would like to continue engaging on this issue. This is going to be a very difficult 2 years for Parliament as it puts together this next version of the Electoral Act. And I think it's important that organizations, not only like the New Nation Movement, but also like the Center for Human Rights, International IDEA, continue to collaborate and make a meaningful contribution to the way forward. So thank you very much to our guests, also to everyone who's joined us at home. I think Taruna has just put up the second version of the poll for everyone to have a look at. Please do answer that. Thank you very much for your time. And I think that's where we'll leave it.
Thank you very much.